In the previous video, we took a look at the divergence between the private sector and public sector U.S. yield curves, and the fact that the private sector yield curve typically does a better job of forecasting future GDP growth than does the public sector curve. But what we've not yet addressed is why have the two diverged? Why is it that the private sector curve still remains inverted, whereas the public sector curve has flipped positive? And the answer comes actually at both ends of the yield curve. So at the short end of the yield curve, U.S. LIBOR rates have risen relative to 3-month T-bills as a result of the funding stress in the repo market, particularly the stress experienced in the middle of September when repo rates blew up to as much as 10%. By contrast, at the long end of the curve, we see the exact opposite. Treasury yields have actually come above swap yields, which is a relatively unusual phenomenon in the history of the markets, although one that we have seen at times over the past 10 years. And there's a very simple explanation as to why this is taking place, and it can be answered in 2 words: budget deficits. For example, during the late 1990s, when the budget deficit turned into a surplus, U.S. Treasury yields plunged compared to swap yields. However, in recent years, with very large budget deficits during the financial crisis and again during the past few years, we've seen a tremendous amount of U.S. Treasury issuance, and that Treasury issuance has pushed the Treasury yield above swap rates. So the yield curves are actually diverging at both the short end and the long end of the curves. And both of these are sending potentially negative signals for the future direction of the U.S. economy. The short end of the curve, funding stress is not a great thing for companies wishing to borrow money. At the same time, a very large U.S. budget deficit could limit the U.S. government's ability to respond in the event of an economic slowdown. The fact of the budget deficit having grown from 2% of GDP in 2016 to nearly 5% of GDP today could make it harder for Congress to cut taxes or raise spending if the economy were to slow down. I'm Eric Norland, Senior Economist with the CME Group in London.